So I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine the other day. We were talking about the greatest horror sequels, and maybe I've done a video on this years ago, but I want to do a new one. This is a video about what I think is 10 of the greatest horror movie sequels of all time. I have a different video where I get to talk about, I'm going to record this soon, where I'm going to talk about 10 horror sequels that are better than the original. I don't know if this list is necessarily kind of the same thing, but in the other one, I'm going to talk about some more cult titles or movies that just the sequels are better than the original. But in this video, I want to do what I think the 10 greatest horror sequels are, and this is going to be fun. Most of these are part 2, so if you want to give your list in the comment section as well, you don't feel the need to have to make every one of them part 2s. A sequel is a sequel is a sequel to me, and all that matters is, do I think it's one of the greatest of all time? So without further ado, let's get in it. The 10 greatest horror sequels ever made. I have an honorable mention, and this honorable mention is a great horror sequel that, in my opinion, eclipses the first movie, and that is Night of the Demons 2. Now, if you're not too familiar with the Night of the Demons sequels, part 2 is the one you definitely need to see. There is a scene in this movie where our girl turns into this snake monster that when I watched it on the movie, I was shocked how intense and insane it was. I couldn't believe how good this movie was. As a horror sequel, it just works on all fronts, and in my opinion, eclipses the first movie of Night of the Demons. I have a motto for sequels: bigger, badder, better. And without a shadow of a doubt, Night of the Demons 2 does just that. So here we go, guys. Number 10. When I think about horror sequels, I think about franchises that are well known in the horror community, and I think about sequels that just eclipse the first movie on a grander scale. I may not necessarily agree with all these, but I think when you look at the grand scope of everything, you have to agree that Puppet Master 3 is one of the best horror sequels. And the reason I really wanted to put this on the list, not so much that I'm a Full Moon fanatic, but let's look at what happened here. Puppet Master comes out in 1989, comes out really in early 1990 where people start seeing it, and Charlie films part 2 and part 3 back to back, and not only that, part 3 came out the same year as part 2. On paper, this should be the biggest fail, flop, disaster in history, but somehow he made Puppet Master 3 the best Puppet Master movie of all time. If you ask 10 people, I think 6 or 7 will say that Puppet Master 3 is the best Puppet Master movie, and I can't really argue that. Even though the first one's my favorite, Puppet Master 3 defies the odds of everything you're supposed to not do, but he did it, and it worked. Puppet Master 3 stands the test of time. Alright guys, coming in at number 9 has to be Child's Play 2. Most people will tell you that this one is, in fact, better than Child's Play. Child's Play 2, I think, really encapsulates what the Child's Play franchise feels like. The soundtrack to Child's Play 2 sounds like a haunted dollhouse. With Chucky being a doll, it just works so perfectly. Even the house that Andy stays at is like a big dollhouse. It was colorful, everything was blue, his bedroom looked like a big doll room. It just worked perfectly, and the makeup effects of Chucky in this, the lines he has, the factory climax in Child's Play 2, I don't care who you are, that is hell. Remember that part in Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses where that old dude just comes out of nowhere and goes, "This is hell"? That's what I feel about with that factory scene. It's just, that as a kid it traumatized me. But Child's Play 2 is one of the greatest horror sequels ever. It is just the fan favorite for a reason. I can't even deny it. Alright guys, so coming in at number 8, this one's kind of cliche, but every time I think I don't feel the certain way about this movie, I have to go back and watch it. And I have a little hint of what that movie is on my desk over here, and I genuinely feel this way. Halloween 2 has to be one of the greatest horror sequels. To me, it is just one of the best slasher sequels of all time. I really love it. Even though there are things about this that people say, well, Laurie's in the hospital, she's comatose for part of the movie, I think now when you look at that, more of the complaints about that is the fact that they've done more movies where they have the same kind of deal with Laurie being in a hospital. But at this time, this was a great atmosphere for a sequel. And I do agree with my buddy Brandon when he says that part 2 feels even more vintage than part 1. Part 2 just feels so immensely vintage, and that's a quality I love. I love Dick Warlock as Michael Myers. I love the soundtrack to this one. The hospital setting is perfect. When I hear Mr. Sandman, I don't think about Back to the Future as much as I think about Halloween 2. I think Mr. Sandman fits this movie better than any movie. I just love Halloween 2. I think the more Halloween films that come out, the more I think that that is in fact the greatest horror sequel I love Halloween too. Coming in at number 7, guys, you talk to people that hate Rob Zombie. They don't like his music, they don't like his movies, even they have to admit that The Devil's Rejects is amazing. And I think when you look at Rob's movies, everybody has comments about his dialogue. Now, Rob grew up in the circus world. His parents worked at carnivals, so that's the kind of people he was around. Just white trash lowlifes. But when you look at that kind of motif that he has and those characters he creates, the setting that he used for The Devil's Rejects was like the perfect fishbowl for that. It just worked perfectly. He got it right. Those characters belong in that desert plain, country field stuff. It works perfectly. When we see those characters go into modern societies, that's when things start feeling a little wrong and weird. But The Rejects is literally him dropping those characters in the perfect setting, and I think that's why it works so well. Everything is just in sync with each other. All right, guys, so coming in at number 6, this one I will just fight to the death about it. Amityville 2, The Possession. This movie has no business being this good. Now, I believe this one was based off of a book, and I think Tommy Lee Wallace either wrote or directed the screenplay for this. But regardless, this movie is insane. What's so surprising about Amityville 2 is the more you watch the movie, the crazier and weirder it gets. And that's something you don't see a whole lot in movies. A lot of times you see the premise set up, and you go through the journey of what's to come. But in this one, each scene gets crazier than the last one to where you're just like, what is going on? It is a scary movie on top of that. And what I love about this movie is Burt Young, who we know as, Uncle Paulie from the Rocky films, plays a dad that is so just mean. I love it so much. Amityville 2, The Possession blew me away the first time I saw it. And although I love Amityville now, I find it to be a classic. Part 2 is a hold my beer kind of sequel. Alright guys, coming in at number 5, I almost wanted to say Part 2, but I have to say what my heart tells me to. Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. Now, Part 2 can't take nothing away from it. It's really the stepping stone for what the franchise became with Jason. No doubt about it. But when I look at the Friday the 13th movies, I feel like the first 4 films are the start of a climbing of a mountain, where the peak of that mountain is the final chapter. And the final chapter, to me, is one of, if not the greatest slasher films ever made. From all the lovable, iconic characters this movie has, to one of the greatest performances of Jason with Ted White. A guy that didn't want to really do the part, but that angst and anger and just not being into it and just wanting to get it over with just comes across in such the perfect way in this film. When it comes to slasher films, people ask me what's the best. I mean, I'm not saying it's not Halloween or anything like that, but pound for pound, the best slasher film to me is The Final Chapter. I will always say that this is the best Friday the 13th. Alright guys, coming in at number 4 is not necessarily a movie that I think is better than its part 1, but when it comes to the greatest sequels of all time, there's no doubt in my mind you have to have George Romero's Dawn of the Dead on this list. I mean, Dawn of the Dead is the zombie film. It's almost the blueprint for everything going forward, and it's just iconic. Everything about this. People go and visit the mall till this very day. When you get into horror, Dawn of the Dead is a title that gets brought up to you almost immediately, and for good reason. It's a masterpiece of the zombie genre. George Romero basically took everything he's done up until that point and created a huge movie with Dawn of the Dead. There are things about Dawn of the Dead, especially in the zombie genre, that haven't been done better than that. So yeah, I can't take nothing away from Dawn of the Dead. While I don't think it's better than Night of the Living Dead personally, there's no doubt in my mind that people will say that, yeah, the best zombie film ever is Dawn of the Dead. Coming in at number 3, guys, is a movie that took the premise of the first one and dunked it on its head, Psycho 2. I mean, Psycho 2 is probably going to be in everybody's list, right? I think Psycho 2 is just, like, shocking at how good it is, and I think that's how people felt when they saw it for the first time, too. I mean, to make a sequel to Psycho years later, what was it, 20-something years after the first one came out, and to make it as good as it was is super impressive. You know, when Tom Holland wrote this, I don't even know if he thought he could really pull this off, but they did it. It's one of the most ingenious ideas I've ever seen. It's almost like a reversed engineered slasher film. Here's a guy that was a slasher more or less, goes to rehab, goes to prison, and comes out. He wants to stop. But it was almost like the movie was saying society didn't want him to be a good person. You're a bad person for life. We're never going to forgive you for what you did. It's brilliant. I mean, Psycho 2 is as brilliant as a sequel as I think anybody could say. So yeah, masterpiece. All right, guys, coming in at number 2, this one, I almost like went back and forth on this, but eventually I had to stop and say, Christian, get your head out of your ass. Even though you love Army of Darkness, there's no doubt one of the greatest sequels of all time is Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2. People call this a sequel. Some people even call this really a remake of the first movie. It doesn't matter. Evil Dead 2 is one of the best movies ever made. There's no doubt if you ask 100 people that probably 85 will say that Evil Dead 2 is the best Evil Dead movie and probably the best Sam Raimi movie. It's just amazing. I love Army of Darkness the most, but I can honestly step back and say, let's be real, Evil Dead 2 is the greatest. And coming in at number 1, if you know me, this comes as no surprise. If you don't know me, well, get ready. To me, the greatest horror sequel of all time is The Exorcist 3. The fans of this channel don't need for me to go over a huge spiel about this again, but The Exorcist 3 is one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. I can watch it obviously by myself, for God's sakes, I'm 32 years old, but it still creeps me out. And it's funny, we talked about Child's Play 2 earlier, but Brad Dourif's performance in this movie is the greatest. Now, Brad Dourif has been in the hugest movies in the world, but his performance in Exorcist 3 as the Zodiac just troubles me. It's almost too good. And the performance of George C. Scott in here as this cop detective is so earnest and believable and real, and he breaks down. He's supposed to be this big, strong man that's got to deal with this and try to help people and keep them safe, but even he has moments where he can't handle what's going on and has breakdowns. The performance is amazing. The performances are what makes The Exorcist 3 so great. People can say that The Exorcist is scarier, and I won't necessarily argue that, but the performances of Exorcist 3 are so good, and the greatest jump scare of all time is in this movie. I will die on the hill that The Exorcist 3 is the greatest horror sequel of all time. That's my favorite horror sequel of all time, and what I think is genuinely the best one. Alright guys, so there you have it. I really am interested to see what you guys would put in your list. If you agree or disagree, let me know down below, and if you enjoy lists like this, please drop a like. I enjoy doing this all day long. I got more to come, so see you guys next time. Huge giant thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, this would not be possible. To get behind the scenes photos, videos, music, private live streams, and much more, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to my patrons.